90 minutes. That's exactly how long it took a jury to decide that the systematic torture and murder of 3-year-old Amari Boone wasn't actually murder at all. 51 days. That's how long this innocent child endured unimaginable suffering before his tiny heart stopped beating on Easter Sunday, 2020. His body told a story that would haunt medical professionals for years. Broken fingers, broken arms, a shattered pelvis, a fractured skull. Doctors compared his injuries to those of someone falling from a multi-story building or being caught in a tornado. Yet somehow, someway, the American justice system decided this wasn't murder. Before we dive deeper into this heartbreaking story, I need to address something that honestly breaks my heart. 98% of you watching this video right now aren't subscribed to this channel. That means out of every 100 people who care enough to watch stories like Amari's, only 2 of you actually hit that subscribe button. If you're one of the 98, I'm genuinely curious, and I want you to tell me in the comments, what's stopping you? Is it that you don't think these stories matter enough? Because I promise you, they do. This is the story of Amari Boone, a little boy with big brown eyes and an infectious smile who deserved so much better than the fate that awaited him. It's a story about a system designed to protect children that instead delivered him into the hands of monsters. And it's a story about how justice can fail so completely that it becomes injustice itself. June 9th, 2016. Fort Worth, Texas. In the maternity ward of a local hospital, the first cry of Amari Boone pierced the air. His parents, Ariana George and Rodney Boone, looked down at their newborn son with that mixture of wonder and overwhelming love that only new parents know. Amari had those big brown eyes that seemed almost too wise for a newborn, and a cap of dark hair that would eventually curl into tight spirals around his face. From his very first days, there was something special about this child. Ariana would later say that Amari was the brightest light she had ever encountered, an easygoing baby who loved to laugh and had this incredible ability to make everyone around him smile. The family didn't have much money, but they had love in abundance. Rodney worked hard to provide for his growing family despite his own legal troubles, while Ariana focused on creating a home for their son. They lived in a small apartment in Fort Worth, dreaming of bigger things, of a better future for the little boy who had become the center of their universe. But even in those early days, cracks were beginning to show. Financial stress is a silent killer of relationships, and Rodney's past legal problems created a constant undercurrent of tension in their home. Still, watching Amari grow brought them moments of pure joy that seemed to make all their struggles worthwhile. As Amari approached his 2nd birthday, his personality began to shine through in the most beautiful ways. He was an active, curious little boy who had developed some very specific preferences. He loved snacks, especially chips and sweets that his parents would buy him as special treats. But more than anything else, he was absolutely obsessed with the cartoon PJ Masks, the story of 3 superhero children who saved the world at night. By his 2nd birthday, Amari had truly become his own little person. He was kind-hearted, loved giving hugs, and rarely fussed without good reason. When Ariana became pregnant with their 2nd child, Amari was thrilled at the thought of becoming a big brother. The future seemed bright, full of possibility. But then came the summer of 2018, and everything began to unravel. The summer of 2018 became the turning point that would ultimately seal Amari's fate, though nobody could have predicted it at the time. Ariana was 9 months pregnant, ready to give birth at any moment, when their world began to crumble in ways that seemed almost orchestrated by cruel fate itself. First, Ariana lost her job. In today's economy, that's hardly unusual, but when you're about to have a baby and already struggling financially, it's devastating. They scrambled to find new employment, but time was running out faster than their savings. The money ran out. The home was lost. Their car was repossessed. In a matter of weeks, they went from being a struggling but stable family to being homeless and desperate. August 15th, 2018. This date would prove to be more significant than anyone realized at the time. Ariana was ready to give birth, and that's when the Texas Child Protective Services system entered their lives for the first time. During routine medical procedures, illegal substances were found in Ariana's system. She admits now that she had been using marijuana, trying desperately to cope with the overwhelming stress of losing everything: her job, her home, her sense of security, all while carrying another child. The arguments in their temporary living situation had become more frequent and more intense. Both Rodney and Ariana, exhausted by financial problems and uncertainty about their future, sometimes lashed out at each other in ways they never had before. The landlord where they were staying eventually evicted Ariana and several other tenants for what he termed aggressive behavior. So there she was, 9 months pregnant, homeless, with a 2-year-old son, and nowhere to go. Ariana moved in with a relative, but everyone understood this was just a temporary band-aid on a much larger wound. Soon after, she gave birth to her second son, giving Amari the little brother he had been so excited about. But instead of being a joyful time, it was overshadowed by uncertainty and fear about what would happen next. Fall 2018 found Ariana in a women's shelter with 2-year-old Amari and a newborn baby. The conditions were exactly what you'd expect: overcrowded, unsanitary, and completely unsuitable for small children. The boys were constantly getting sick, and Ariana found herself missing scheduled substance abuse tests because she was dealing with sick children in an environment that seemed designed to keep them sick. It was during this lowest point in her life that Ariana began to hear echoes of messages that had been drilled into her head since childhood. Messages from public service announcements, from schools, from politicians' speeches. The child protection system is here to help families. The government will support you in your time of need. We're here to help you get back on your feet. These messages had been so pervasive, so convincing, that Ariana genuinely believed them. She looked at her 2 sons, Amari, who should have been running around and playing like any normal 2-year-old, instead getting sick repeatedly in a shelter that was no place for children, and her newborn, who deserved so much better than this, and she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the first week of October 2018, Ariana voluntarily signed over temporary custody of both her sons to the state of Texas. She genuinely believed she was doing the right thing for her children. "I thought I was doing the right thing for my children," she would later say, her voice breaking. "I wanted them to be safe and fed while I got my life together." Rodney supported this decision. He too had been raised on the same propaganda about government assistance being there when families needed it most. Together, they called social services, asking for help, believing they were accessing a safety net that would catch their family and help them land back on their feet. What they didn't know was that they weren't signing a temporary help agreement. They were signing what would become a death sentence for their son. And here's something that absolutely breaks my heart. I know that many of you watching this can relate to Ariana's situation in some way. Maybe you've faced impossible choices. Maybe you've trusted systems that failed you. If this story is resonating with you, if you believe stories like this need to be told, then I'm asking you directly, why haven't you subscribed? What would it take for you to join the small percentage of viewers who actually support this channel? Because without your support, stories like Amari's don't get the attention they deserve. For more than a year, Amari and his little brother disappeared into the maze of the Texas foster care system. Think about that for a moment. Over a year of a small child's life, moving from place to place like luggage. How many unfamiliar faces did he see? How many times was he moved from one temporary home to another? How many times did he have to adjust to new rules, new people, new environments? The system that had promised stability and care provided them with exactly the opposite, a life of constant upheaval and uncertainty. During this entire time, Ariana lived with a secret shame that was eating her alive. She desperately tried to hide from friends and family the fact that she had lost custody of her children. She was embarrassed, heartbroken, and desperately hoping to get them back before anyone discovered what had happened. But she wasn't sitting idle. Ariana was doing everything the system asked of her, and more. She attended rehabilitation programs, she looked for stable housing, she found work, she went to every single mandatory parenting class that social services required. She was jumping through every hoop they put in front of her, believing that if she just followed their rules perfectly, her family would be reunited. For Rodney, this period was even more challenging. While his sons were in state custody, his own legal troubles continued to mount. From January to March 2019, he was in jail, completely separated from his children and unable to help with the reunification process. By January 2020, it seemed like things were finally turning around. Ariana's life was stabilizing in all the ways the system had demanded. She was clean from illegal substances and had maintained steady employment. She had completed all the mandatory parenting classes and was complying with every requirement social services had placed on her. It was at this point that the system made a decision that would prove to be fatal. They decided to move the boys from regular foster care to what's called fictive placement. Now, this might sound like a good thing. Instead of being placed with strangers, the children would be placed with someone who already had a relationship with the family but wasn't biologically related. Unlike regular foster care placements, fictive placements don't have to meet the same rigorous standards as traditional foster homes. The requirements are more relaxed, the oversight is less intensive, and the assumption is that because there's a pre-existing relationship, less monitoring is needed. January 27th, 2020. This is the date that sealed Amari's fate, though nobody knew it at the time. Amari and his little brother were placed in the home of Deandrich Foley and his partner, Joseph Delancey. Rodney had known Deandrich for more than 12 years. They had met at work when Rodney was employed at a fast food restaurant and Deandrich was his supervisor. It seemed like a perfect arrangement. The children would be with someone their father knew and trusted, someone who had been in a position of responsibility and authority. Neither Ariana nor Rodney knew Joseph well. They might have met him in passing at social gatherings, but they didn't really know him as a person. Still, he was Deandrich's partner, and if Deandrich was trustworthy, surely Joseph was too. The placement process seemed thorough enough. Both Deandrich and Joseph had passed their background checks without any red flags. A social worker had conducted a home visit and found everything to be in order. The home was clean, well-maintained, and suitable for children. The couple presented as engaged, enthusiastic caregivers who were excited about the opportunity to help these boys. Initial reports were glowing. The social worker conducting scheduled visits found that Amari and his brother had adjusted remarkably well to their new environment. They were described as thriving in their new home. Deandrich and Joseph were praised as being attentive, caring, and committed to the children's well-being. Everything seemed absolutely perfect. The boys appeared happy and healthy. Their caregivers seemed devoted and responsible. Ariana and Rodney felt like their family was finally on the path to reunification. After all the struggles, all the separation, all the bureaucratic hurdles, it looked like their story might actually have a happy ending. But in stories like this one, when everything seems perfect, it usually means something is terribly, terribly wrong. And I have to pause here to ask you something that's been weighing on my mind. We're now deep into Amari's story, and I'm wondering, are you one of the 98% who's going to watch this entire video, feel moved by this little boy's story, maybe even shed a tear, and then leave without subscribing? Because if you are, I genuinely want to understand why. What is it about supporting channels that tell these important stories that feels so difficult? Leave me a comment and help me understand, because right now it feels like we're failing these children twice. Once when the system fails them, and again when we fail to amplify their stories. Just 3 weeks after Amari was placed in what everyone believed was a safe, loving home, the first warning sign appeared. But like so many warning signs in this case, it was ignored, explained away, and filed under accidents happen. February 18th, 2020. Amari was admitted to Cook Children's Hospital with what his caregivers described as an ankle injury. They explained to medical staff that the 3-year-old had fallen down the stairs. It seemed plausible enough. Young children fall downstairs all the time, and ankle injuries, while concerning, aren't usually cause for major alarm. But when doctors examined Amari more thoroughly, they discovered something that should have immediately triggered a full investigation. This 3-year-old child didn't just have an ankle injury. He had a broken pelvis. Let me help you understand what this means. A broken pelvis in a 3-year-old child is not something that happens from falling downstairs. The pelvis is one of the strongest bone structures in the human body, surrounded and protected by major muscle groups. For a small child to sustain a pelvic fracture requires tremendous force. the kind of force associated with car accidents or severe physical abuse. Try to imagine what this meant for little Amari. Every step he took caused excruciating pain. The active, playful little boy who used to run around and laugh was now moving like an elderly person, carefully and slowly, trying to find ways to walk without causing himself more agony. He had learned, at 3 years old, to hide his pain and make himself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. Social worker Sheila Robertson received information about this hospitalization. This should have been the moment when alarm bells started ringing, when a full investigation was launched, when Amari was immediately removed from that home. Instead, Robertson made a decision that would prove to be catastrophic. She didn't even document the hospital visit in Amari's file. Think about that. A 3-year-old in state custody ends up in the hospital with a broken pelvis, and the social worker responsible for his safety doesn't even consider it worth documenting. It was as if a broken pelvis in a 3-year-old was just a normal household injury, not worth anyone's attention or concern. Meanwhile, Amari was learning survival skills that no child should ever have to learn. In a house where any movement, any sound, any childish behavior could trigger explosive violence, he was becoming quieter, smaller, more invisible. The child who had once been described as having an infectious smile was learning that smiling might be dangerous. March 7, 2020. Ariana received permission from Deandrich to take Amari on what the system classified as an unauthorized visit to her aunt's house. When she saw her son up close for the first time in weeks, her heart stopped. Amari had bruises around both eyes. His lip was swollen and cut. There were visible bruises on his ribs that he couldn't hide. But what terrified Ariana most wasn't the physical evidence of abuse, it was how completely her son had changed. The cheerful, talkative little boy she remembered had become withdrawn and cautious. He flinched at sudden movements. He spoke much more quietly than usual, as if he had learned that being heard was dangerous. When she asked him directly, "Did someone do this to you?" 3-year-old Amari answered with a simple yes. But when she asked him who had hurt him, he went silent. Maybe he had already learned that telling the truth was dangerous. Maybe he was protecting himself the only way a 3-year-old knew how, by not saying anything at all. When social worker Robertson called Ariana, she wasn't interested in hearing about the injuries her client was reporting. She wasn't concerned about the visible signs of abuse on a child in her care. Her only focus was on the fact that Ariana had taken Amari on an unauthorized visit. Robertson demanded that the child be returned to his caregivers immediately. When Ariana tearfully tried to explain what she was seeing, the bruises, the swelling, the dramatic change in her son's behavior, Robertson threatened her with legal consequences if she didn't return Amari immediately. "What am I supposed to do?" Ariana cried into the phone. "Return him to the people who are beating him." But Robertson's mind was made up. Amari was taken to the hospital for examination, and while the medical report noted that the bruises were concerning, no action was taken to remove him from the home. He was sent back to the same people who had already broken his pelvis and were now systematically beating him. March 11th, a court-appointed special advocate finally visited the home where Amari was living. What she witnessed should have resulted in immediate action. Amari was sitting in a corner, quiet and almost motionless. The couple wasn't allowing him to drink water, a form of abuse that's particularly cruel because it causes constant discomfort and can lead to serious health complications. She watched as one of the caregivers roughly grabbed the little boy by the arm. Amari didn't cry out or protest. He just seemed to shrink into himself, as if he was accustomed to this kind of treatment and had learned that resistance only made things worse. When the advocate called Robertson to report what she had witnessed, Robertson became furious. But she wasn't angry about the child abuse that had just been reported to her. She was angry that the advocate had called the child abuse hotline. Let that sink in for a moment. A court-appointed advocate, whose job it is to protect children, reports witnessing abuse, and the social worker gets angry at the advocate for reporting it. April 3rd, Robertson and her supervisors finally made a plan to remove Amari from the home if any further incidents occurred. But by then, it was far too late. The damage had been done, and the worst was yet to come. Amari had learned to live in constant fear and pain. The child who used to fall asleep listening to stories about PJ Masks superheroes was now afraid to sleep. He had learned to walk on his tiptoes to avoid attracting attention. He had learned to eat quickly and silently. Most heartbreakingly of all, he had learned not to cry, even when the pain was unbearable. And I need to stop here and ask you something directly. If this story is affecting you, if you believe that Amari's story deserves to be heard, if you think that shining light on these system failures might help protect other children, then why, and I'm asking this genuinely, why won't you hit the subscribe button? What would it take? Because right now, it feels like we're all complicit in a different kind of silence when we consume these stories but don't take the simple step of supporting the channels that tell them. The final weeks of March and early April 2020 became a blur of escalating violence and systematic torture for 3-year-old Amari. What was happening in that house wasn't discipline or even severe physical abuse. It was methodical torture designed to inflict maximum pain and fear. In this house, every normal childhood action became a reason for punishment. Spilling milk at breakfast meant having heavy feet step on his little fingers one by one until the bones cracked. Not making it to the bathroom in time meant having his tiny toes bent backward until they snapped. Amari was learning that being a child was dangerous, that every natural impulse could result in agony. April 6th, the caregivers actually sent photos to social worker Robertson showing Amari's swollen, blackened eye. Instead of recognizing this as clear evidence of abuse, Robertson, who had no medical training whatsoever, instantly diagnosed it as allergies without even bothering to see the child in person. April 8th, Rodney had a scheduled video call with his son. What he saw on that screen would haunt him forever. Amari had a black eye and facial swelling, but what alarmed his father most was how completely his child had changed. The little boy who used to chatter endlessly during their calls now spoke only in single words. He avoided looking at the camera, as if even making eye contact had become dangerous. When Rodney asked about the injuries, he was told that Amari's little brother hit him with a TV remote and that he had crashed into a fence. These explanations might sound plausible to someone who wasn't looking closely, but Rodney knew his son. He knew something was terribly wrong. April 9th, the daycare director made what would be the final report to Robertson before Amari's death. She said that Amari had returned after 2 days of absence with 2 black eyes. The child looked broken, she said. He no longer played with other children, sat alone, and spoke only in whispers. Amari doesn't look right, she told Robertson. Something is wrong. Robertson systematically ignored this report, just as she had ignored every other warning sign. The broken pelvis that never made it into the official documents. The advocate's eyewitness report of abuse. The photographs of injuries. The daycare director's concerns. Every single alarm that was raised was dismissed, ignored, or explained away. By this point, new bruises were appearing on Amari's body with terrifying regularity, on his neck, his chest, his back, everywhere they could be hidden under clothing. His small body was becoming a roadmap of systematic abuse, and still, no one in the system that was supposed to protect him took action. The morning of Friday, April 10th, 2020, began what would be the last day of Amari Boone's life. According to Joseph Delancey's later testimony, he woke up around 7:30 a.m. to find that Amari had wet the bed during the night. In most homes, this would be a minor inconvenience requiring some laundry and maybe a gentle reminder about using the bathroom. But in this house, bedwetting was another crime that required punishment. Joseph told police that he placed Amari on the bathroom counter to change him, then went to get wet wipes. When he returned, he claimed Amari had allegedly fallen from the counter and hit his head. According to Joseph's version of events, the boy immediately jumped up and started talking, seeming fine except for a headache. But Deandrich Foley's version of events was different. He claimed he found Amari lying between the beds, crushed by a fallen playpen. Pink foam was coming from the child's mouth, blood was flowing from his ear, and there were wet spots on the bed and floor around him. When police later searched the apartment, they found evidence that someone had tried frantically to clean up significant blood stains on the bed, on the windowsill, in the bathroom, on sheets. They also found a bag containing bloody clothing sitting on the dining table. But perhaps the most telling piece of evidence was the timeline. The couple claimed they found Amari around 7:25 in the morning. Hospital surveillance footage shows their car arriving at the emergency entrance at 8:13 a.m. The drive from their home to Cook Children's Medical Center typically takes 12 to 18 minutes. This means they had 48 minutes to make an 18-minute drive. What were they doing during those missing 30 minutes while a 3-year-old child was dying? When they finally arrived at the hospital, medical staff immediately noticed that Amari's body was rigid and positioned unnaturally, a clear sign of severe brain trauma. The doctors who examined him discovered injuries so extensive and horrific that seasoned medical professionals were left shaken. Amari had suffered a skull fracture from blunt force head trauma, causing massive brain damage and bleeding. But that was just the beginning. The examination revealed evidence of systematic, prolonged torture that painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty. He had a broken pelvis that had never properly healed from the February incident. Both of his arms were broken. Multiple fingers and toes were fractured. Several ribs were broken. His foot bones were fractured. He was bleeding from his right ear and had cuts on his forehead. There was bleeding in his eyes from the trauma. Most damning of all, the injuries showed different stages of healing, proving beyond any doubt that Amari had been beaten regularly and systematically for weeks. This wasn't a single incident of violence. This was prolonged torture. The medical team at Cook Children's Hospital was prepared to fight for Amari's life with everything they had. But within an hour of his arrival, it became clear that the damage to his brain was too extensive. The injuries were what medical professionals call life incompatible, meaning that no amount of medical intervention could save him. For the next 36 hours, Ariana and Rodney never left their son's bedside. They watched helplessly as his small body endured seizure after seizure, his brain trying desperately to function despite the devastating trauma. "Mommy's right here," Ariana whispered to her unconscious son. "I'm right here.
We love you, Mari.
Everyone's rooting for you." After 2 separate tests confirmed what everyone already knew, doctors gently explained to Amari's parents that their son would not be coming back. Little Amari's brain had died, and the machines were the only thing keeping his body functioning. In the early hours of Easter morning, a day when Christians celebrate resurrection and new life, the decision was made to remove Amari from life support. He died at 1:19 a.m. on April 12, 2020, just 74 days after being placed in what was supposed to be a safe, loving home. On the day when the world celebrates hope and renewal, a little boy with big brown eyes and an infectious smile quietly left this world, having experienced more pain and terror in his short life than most people could imagine in their worst nightmares. And before we continue to the final part of the story, I need to ask you something. If you've made it this far, if Amari's story has touched you, if you believe that stories like this need to be told so that maybe, just maybe, we can prevent the next tragedy, then please, I'm begging you, hit the subscribe button. Because 98% of you won't, and I can't understand why. Are these stories not important enough? Are these children not worth the simple act of subscription? Help me understand, because without your support, voices like Amari's get lost in the silence. The Tarrant County Medical Examiner's autopsy confirmed what the hospital had already discovered, but the official findings were even more damning than anyone had anticipated. The various injuries at different stages of healing proved conclusively that Amari had been systematically tortured over an extended period. The catastrophic final injuries were consistent with someone falling from a multi-story building, being thrown from a vehicle during a high-speed crash, or being struck by tornado debris. Amari Boone's death was officially ruled a homicide. Despite this clear determination, charges were not filed for an unconscionably long time. While the evidence was overwhelming, while the medical findings were unambiguous, while a 3-year-old child lay dead from obvious torture, the system that had failed to protect him in life continued to fail him in death. Ariana held peaceful protests, standing outside government buildings with signs bearing her son's picture, calling for justice for Amari. She became a solitary figure demanding accountability from a system that seemed determined to avoid it. For months, she stood alone, a grieving mother fighting for her dead child while those responsible for his death walked free. Finally, on January 22, 2021, 9 months after Amari's death, arrests were made. DeAndre Foley and Joseph Delancey were taken into custody and charged. But even then, the charges were not what anyone expected given the horrific nature of Amari's injuries. DeAndre was charged with 7 counts of injury to a child by omission resulting in bodily injury. Each charge carried a $15,000 bond, meaning his total bail was set at just over $100,000 for his role in the torture and death of a 3-year-old child. Joseph was charged with only 1 count of injury to a child by omission resulting in serious bodily injury. His bond was set even lower. Both men easily posted bail and were released after spending less than a week in jail. Think about that. Less than a week in jail for the systematic torture and murder of a child whose injuries were compared to tornado victims. Meanwhile, Amari's family filed a civil lawsuit against Child and Family Services, Our Community, Our Kids, and the state of Texas. Unlike criminal court, where the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, civil proceedings operate under a lower standard of evidence. In civil court, there was more than sufficient evidence to prove that the system had failed catastrophically. The state of Texas acknowledged its guilt by agreeing to pay Amari's family $6 million in compensation. $6 million for the life of a little boy. Money that couldn't bring back his laughter, couldn't erase the memory of his suffering, couldn't fill the enormous emptiness in his parents' hearts. But the most shocking moment was yet to come. In March 2025, after an 8-day trial in the 371st District Court of Tarrant County, Joseph Delancey faced a jury of his peers. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The medical testimony was damning. The timeline was suspicious. The injuries spoke for themselves. The jury deliberated for exactly 90 minutes. 90 minutes to decide the fate of the man who had tortured a 3-year-old child for 51 days. 90 minutes to weigh the evidence of systematic abuse, broken bones, and ultimately murder. 90 minutes to determine whether justice would finally be served for Amari Boone. After those 90 minutes, the jury returned with their verdict, not guilty on all charges, including capital murder and murder in the commission of a felony. Joseph Delancey walked out of that courtroom a free man. DeAndre Foley's case had similar results. Not a single person received even 1 day in prison for Amari's death. A boy who was systematically tortured for 51 days never received justice. The system that failed him in life failed him again in death. In civil court, his life was valued at $6 million. In criminal court, it wasn't worth a single day behind bars. This is the reality we live in. A system that can acknowledge its failures and pay monetary damages, but somehow cannot hold individuals criminally accountable for torturing a child to death. A system where broken pelvises in 3-year-olds don't warrant documentation, where social workers ignore eyewitness reports of abuse, where court-appointed advocates are criticized for reporting what they see. Amari Boone was buried at Cedar Hill Memorial Park. His grave marker bears testimony to who he really was, not a victim, not a case number, not a statistic, but a little boy who is remembered as very smart, who made everyone smile, whose big brown eyes and curly black hair and infectious laugh won over everyone who met him. He was playful, cheerful, and radiantly happy before the system that was supposed to protect him delivered him into hell. Everyone who loved him was let down by institutions that exist, supposedly, to help families and children. The questions that haunt this case will never be fully answered. How does a social worker not document a broken pelvis in a 3-year-old? How does a system designed to protect children systematically ignore every warning sign? How does a jury deliberate for only 90 minutes before deciding that the torture and murder of a child isn't actually murder? But perhaps the most important question is this: what are we going to do about it? Amari's story isn't unique. Across this country, children in state custody are being failed by the very systems designed to protect them. Social workers carrying impossible caseloads, inadequate training, insufficient oversight, and a culture that prioritizes bureaucratic efficiency over child safety. Every day, children are suffering in silence, just like Amari did. Every day, warning signs are being ignored, just like they were in his case. Every day, The most vulnerable members of our society are being failed by institutions that should be their last line of defense. Someday, and I pray it soon, little Amari will receive the justice he deserves. Not in this life, perhaps, but in the court of history that will judge how we treated our most vulnerable children. Rest in peace, little angel. Your story has been heard, your life had meaning, and your memory will not be forgotten.